The priest closed the prayer book and made the sign of the cross over the dark wooden coffin. Around the freshly dug grave, the entire village of Serafanda huddled in silence. The men with hats in hand, the women with black shawls covering their tear-stained faces. Vicente Aparecido Duarte was not crying. He stood there, with his newborn son in his arms, staring at the hole in the ground like someone looking into an abyss that had swallowed his own life. "She left trying to bring this boy into the world," said Donna Corina, Vicente's mother, squeezing her son's shoulder. "Now, all we have left is to pray." No one there knew, because no one had been allowed to open that coffin one last time, that inside it there was no body at all. Only stones, an old dress, and the weight of a lie that would take 9 years to come to light. 9 years later, at a fair in the neighboring town, a seamstress with clear eyes and agile hands would embroider. Without knowing she was being watched, the same flower design that adorned the blanket of a boy's crib whom she had never seen grow up, and someone, in the middle of the crowd, would stop breathing upon recognizing that embroidery. This is the story of Orela Nascimento, the woman whom the Duarte family buried alive in a lie, and who one day returned to claim what was hers by right: her name, her son, and the truth. If you like strong stories, full of twists that touch the heart, stay with me until the end, because this one will hold you from beginning to end. The Fazenda Boya Esperanca was 2 hours by cart from the nearest village, surrounded by low hills and pastures yellowed by drought. It was there that Orela Nascimento arrived at the age of 20, daughter of a deceased laborer and a seamstress who could barely support the two of them, to work as a helper in the Duarte family's big house. Vicente was the only male child of Donna Corina, widow of a colonel who had left land, cattle, and a reputation too heavy for any daughter-in-law to carry. When the young man fell in love with the simple girl who mended the house's clothes, the mother swallowed her disapproval in silence, hoping that time would resolve what she herself did not have the courage to prevent. "You were not born for this life, my son," Donna Corina would say whenever they were alone. "A woman with no name, no land, no family of weight. What can she give you besides work and shame?" Vicente He married Orela in a small ceremony at the village church, with few guests and a simple cornmeal cake. They were happy for 2 years, in the Mudan stick house he built with his own hands, far from the main house of the farm, as if that distance could protect them from the mother-in-law's contempt. When Orela became pregnant, Vicente's joy was so great that he himself told the news to every resident of the village, one by one, as if it were the best news in the world. Donna Corina, upon learning of it, said only, "May God protect this child from the mother's weak blood." No one understood at the time what she meant by that. The birth came early, on a night of heavy rain, when the paths became impassable and there was no way to fetch the doctor from the city. The region's midwife, Donna Zulmira, was called in a hurry, and the labor stretched for almost an entire day. Orela screamed, bled, nearly fainted from exhaustion. But the boy was born alive, strong, with lungs full of a cry that echoed through the entire house. It was after the birth that everything changed. Donna Corina arrived at the Muden stick house before Don alone and ordered everyone to withdraw, including Vicente, who was exhausted and fell asleep in a hammock on the veranda. After hours of vigil, only she, the midwife, and Orela remained, still too weak to react. What happened in that room, no one else saw. But when the sun rose, Donna Corina came out crying, announcing to the neighbors who were already gathering outside that her daughter-in-law had not survived, that the body had lost too much blood, and her heart had stopped while everyone was sleeping. Vicente woke up to his own mother's scream. "She is gone, my son. I tried, but there was no time to call you." The young man ran into the room and found the bed empty, the sheets stained, and the midwife, with her head lowered, unable to look him in the eyes. He asked for Orela. shouted her name throughout the entire house. But Donna Corina held his arm with a strength he never knew his mother had. "The body has already been prepared, my son. It is better that you do not see it. Keep the memory of her alive, not the pain of the end." Vicente insisted on seeing his wife one last time, but Donna Corina and the midwife said that the body was already sealed inside the coffin by medical order, because of a fever that had set in during the last hours. And that could be dangerous. A dark wooden coffin arrived at the farm still that afternoon, already closed, nailed shut, ready to be taken to the village cemetery. The funeral was quick. The entire village attended, moved by the tragedy of the young mother who had died giving birth. No one questioned the closed coffin, because in that time and in that place, it was common to seal the bodies of women in childbirth early for fear of infection. Vicente's pain seemed too real for anyone to doubt. The boy received the name Bento and was raised by his grandmother, who assumed the role of mother with a dedication that impressed the neighbors. Vicente was never the same again. He worked in silence, greeted others little, and every Sunday he took wildflowers to his wife's grave, without imagining that down there was nothing but stones and an old dress. The village, little by little, went on with its life, as it always did after any loss. The women commented on the tragedy for a few weeks at their doorsteps. The men raised their hats in respect every time they crossed paths with Vicente on the road, and the priest included Orila's name in the Sunday prayers, along with the other deceased of that year. Over time, the subject faded away, as all pain fades when it is no longer fed by fresh memories. Donna Corina cared for her grandson with a zeal that bordered on obsession. She hired a wet nurse from the region, then a private teacher to teach the boy to read even before the right age. And she did not allow Bento to leave the main house of the farm alone. Vicente, absorbed in his own pain, let his mother decide almost everything, unable to gather the strength to argue about anything concerning his son's upbringing. There were nights when Vicente dreamed of his wife. He dreamed that she knocked on the door of the Madanstic house, soaked from the rain, asking to come in. He would wake up sweating, with his heart racing, and would stay for hours, sitting on the veranda, looking into the darkness, not understanding why that dream kept returning. "You need to rest that head," said Zika, the oldest foreman on the farm, one of the few who dared to speak openly with the boss. "It's been 9 months since Donna Aurela left. You cannot carry this weight forever." Vicente would only nod, without the courage to say that the weight he carried was not only that of longing, but of a doubt that he himself could not name, a feeling that something, on that rainy dawn, had not happened the way they had told him. What no one knew, not even Vicente, was that on that same dawn, when they announced the death, a covered cart had left Fazenda Boa, Esperanca, toward the southern road, carrying a weak woman, still bleeding, gagged by fear and by a strong dose of sleeping herb that the midwife had given her. Donna Corina's orders. Orila did not die that night. She was taken, still between life and unconsciousness, far away from the farm she once called home. When Orela finally opened her eyes, 3 days had passed. She was lying on a strange bed, in a mud house surrounded by tall weeds, recognizing nothing around her. A middle-aged woman, presented as a distant cousin of Donna Corina, cared for her with a coldness that seemed more like obligation than kindness. "You will stay here until Mrs. Corina decides what to do," said the woman, whose name was Dana, "and it is best not to make a scene. Se passe well, but she also knows how to be harsh when disobeyed." Orila asked for her son, screamed, cried, tried to get up more than once, but her body, still weak from childbirth and sedation, would not obey. It was Dana Arquilia who, weeks later, told her the naked and raw truth, that everyone at Fazenda Boa, Esperanca, believed she was dead, that a coffin had been buried in her name, and that if she dared to return or send any news, Donna Corina had sworn to destroy the boy's reputation, publicly calling him the son of a dishonest mother who had faked her own death to run away with another man. "That is not true," Orila whispered, without strength to shout anymore. "I would never do that to my son." "It does not matter what is true," replied Donna Archilia. without looking her in the eyes. What matters is what people will believe. And in this region, whoever has land and a surname is always believed first. There were months of a silence that hurt more than any physical wound. Orilla learned to swallow her tears on the nights when the memory of her own newborn son's cry visited her in dreams. She finally asked that they at least give her work, any work, so as not to go crazy with her own thoughts. That is how she returned to sewing. First, small mends for Donna Ercilia's house, then entire pieces that the woman sold at the fair in the neighboring village, keeping almost all the profit for herself. It took Orilla 4 years to gather enough coins, hidden inside a mattress lining, to think about escaping that house. It took another 2 to gather the actual courage, because every time she imagined herself free, the fear came that the threat against her son would be carried out. It was only when she learned from a traveling salesman who sold threads and needles that Fazenda Boa Esperanca continued to prosper, and the boy was growing up well cared for, that Orilla understood. She needed to approach little by little, without haste, without exposing anyone, until she found a way to tell the truth without destroying the peace that her son had managed to build. She moved alone to Varga Malta a little over a year ago, adopting the name Nazari, her late mother's surname, so as not to risk being recognized by someone who might one day pass by Fazenda Boa. She rented a small room at the back of a widow's house, set up her sewing stall at the fair, and gradually won the trust and admiration of the neighborhood for her talent with her hands and her discreet way of being. It was on a fair morning, in the neighboring town of Varga Malta, that fate decided to move. 9 years passed. Bento grew up strong, like his father in his mannerisms, and like a woman he never knew in the way he furrowed his brow when thinking. Donna Corina raised him with mixed rigor and affection, always repeating that his mother had been a saint taken too soon. Vicente, for his part, aged before his time. He never wanted to marry again, despite his mother's insistence, who saw it as a way to erase forever the memory of the daughter-in-law who had bothered her so much in life. He said that his heart had already been buried with Orilla, and no one argued with that pain. It was on a fair morning, in the neighboring town of Varga Malta, that fate decided to move. Donna Corina had taken Bento to buy fabric for new clothes, since the boy was growing too fast for his old pants. At the fabric stall, a new seamstress had set up a few months earlier, coming from who knows where, with a rare talent for embroidery that was already being talked about throughout the region. Her name was Nazari. According to what she told the customers, she had clear, honey-colored eyes and a quiet way of working, always with her head lowered over the needle, like someone carrying a burden she prefers not to share with anyone. When Donna Corina approached the stall, asking for fabric for her grandson's clothes, the seamstress raised her eyes and froze. For an instant that seemed to last an eternity, she stood looking at the boy next to the lady, unable to say a word. "Are you all right, ma'am?" asked Donna Corina, uncomfortable with the silence. "Forgive me," replied Nazari, her voice trembling. "The boy reminded me of someone." They chose the fabric, and before leaving, Bento, curious about the designs displayed at the stall, pointed to a piece of cloth folded in a corner. A small embroidered cloth with a mandakaru flower surrounded by tiny heart-shaped stitches. "This design is the same as my blanket," said the boy, excited. "My grandmother says. My mother made it before I was born." Nazari dropped the scissors on the ground. Donna Corina, without realizing what was happening, pulled her grandson by the hand and thanked her, heading to another stall. But Nazari remained there, standing still, watching the boy's back move away, with her chest tight in a way she had not felt in 9 years. That mandakaru flower embroidery was a technique she herself had invented when she lived at Fazenda Boa. As a secret she had only taught to one person, her mother-in-law, when she was still trying, unsuccessfully, to win the affection of the woman who despised her so much. From that day on, Nazari began to ask, discreetly, about the Duarte family. Little by little, through the loose comments of the other vendors at the fair, she discovered the story that the entire region knew. The young wife who died in childbirth, the husband who was never the same again, the boy raised by the rigid and devout grandmother. She knew that story was a lie, because she was the very woman who was supposedly buried in the Sarafunda cemetery. In the following months, Nazari approached, without revealing who she was, Donna Filo, an old neighbor from Fazenda Boa, Esparanca, who now lived in Varga Malta and attended the same church. It was by talking to her, with careful questions disguised as curiosity, that Nazari confirmed the details she feared. Vicente never knew the truth. He too had been deceived. That Dana Corina was always one to frown at her daughter-in-law. Dana Filo told her, without imagining to whom she was speaking. Many people found it strange that the coffin was sealed so quickly, but who would doubt a husband's pain? It was Donna Filo who, unknowingly, planted the first seed of distrust that would lead the truth to open up. She commented, distractedly, that the old midwife of the region, Donna Zulmira, was still alive, now living in a simple house behind the church, sick and repentant of something she never told anyone. Nazari went after her. She found the old midwife one Sunday afternoon, sitting at her front door, her eyes already weak, her hands trembling. Upon approaching and saying her real name, she saw the woman turn pale and clutch her chest. "I knew that one day this would come back," said Donna Zulmira, her voice choked. "I prayed for 9 years, asking forgiveness for that night." That same afternoon, sitting beside the old midwife, Orilla felt her whole body tremble. For 9 years, she had imagined that moment in 1,000 different ways, and none of them resembled the simplicity of two women sitting on a wooden bench, the sun setting slowly behind the church, while one confessed and the other, finally, heard the missing piece to complete her own story. "I need you to put this on paper," said Orilla, holding the midwife's trembling hands. "Not to condemn you, Donna Zulmira, to free me and my son from this lie." Donna Zulmira agreed, and the next day, before the village priest, she dictated word for word what had happened that dawn, signing the paper with the shaky handwriting of someone who had not written in years. The priest, shaken by the account, kept the document and promised to support Orilla in whatever was necessary, as long as she decided to face the truth with the Duarte family personally, without public scandal, so as not to expose the boy even more, who had nothing to do with the adult's mistakes. Donna Zulmira told everything, between tears and pauses to breathe, that Donna Corina had arrived desperate, not with news of a death, but with a demand. She told the midwife that her daughter-in-law needed to disappear before sunrise, because she had discovered, days earlier, that Orilla's family held an old right over part of the lands of Fazenda Boa, a debt of honor that Donna Corina's own father had left registered in the notary decades before, and had never paid to Orilla's grandfather. If Orilla lived and raised a son as the legitimate heir of that ancient right could one day be claimed by the boy in his mother's name, dividing the farm that Donna Corina had sworn to keep whole until her death. "She paid me to give a strong herbal tea that would leave the girl sleeping for days," confessed the midwife. "She said she would take her far away to a house of distant relatives, and that when the girl woke up, everything would already be resolved. She said it was only to take her away, not to harm her." Orilla woke up days later, weak and confused, in an isolated house in the rural area of another municipality, in the care of a distant cousin of Donna Corina, who received money every month to keep her there, under the threat that if she tried to return or reveal who she was, the boy would suffer the consequences. He would be called the son of a dishonest woman. He would lose the surname, and Vicente himself would be destroyed by the public shame of a wife who faked her own death, trapped between the fear of destroying her son's life and the pain of having been torn from him. Orilla took years gathering courage and resources to free herself from that dependence. She worked secretly as a seamstress in the house where she lived, until she saved enough to move to Varga Malta, close enough to try to understand, from afar, how her son was growing up, without yet knowing how to approach, without destroying everything she feared destroying. With Donna Zulmira's confession in hand, and the silent support of Donna Filo, Orilla decided that she no longer had anything to lose except her own silence. She went to Fazenda Boa, Esparanca, on a Friday afternoon. Her heart racing, her hands sweating cold. She found Vicente sitting on the veranda, his hair already streaked with white, mending a leather harness. He raised his eyes to the woman standing at the gate, and for a moment thought he was seeing a ghost. "Orella," he whispered, letting the harness fall. "I am so sorry it took me so long," she replied, her voice trembling. "I did not die, Vicente. I never died." What followed was an afternoon of explanations interrupted by tears, of questions that neither of them knew how to answer properly, of an embrace that the two held for long minutes, as if they wanted to recover at once the 9 years that had been lost. Bento, when called, stood still in the middle of the yard, looking at that unknown woman whom his father presented as his mother. He did not understand, could not understand immediately. But when she showed the mandekaru flower embroidery, the same design as the crib blanket, something inside him recognized, even without words, the truth of it all. Donna Corina, when confronted, first denied everything. She called Orela an impostor. Said it was a scheme by someone interested in the family's lands, and demanded that Vicente call the village sheriff to investigate the woman who presented herself with such a story. "Call whoever you want, mother," replied Vicente, with a firmness his own voice had never had in front of her, "because I am going to call Donna Zulmira too. And this time you will have to explain why a woman you swear you buried with your own hands knows every detail of this house, every embroidery, every song that I myself sang to Bento when he was little and could not sleep." The silence that followed lasted longer than any words could last. Donna Corina looked at her grandson, who held tightly the piece of embroidered cloth, his eyes full of a question he still did not know how to formulate properly, and felt, for the first time in 9 years, the full weight of what she had done. Faced with the written confession that Donna Zulmira had made before the village priest, and with the weight of her own grandson looking at her with a disappointment she had never seen in those eyes, she broke. "I did this thinking about the farm, about the family name," she said, crying for the first time in years. "I did not think about you. I only thought about not losing what was mine." The region's justice system handled the case with discretion, respecting Vicente's request not to publicly expose his elderly mother. But it required her to formally return the recognition of Orela's rights over the part of the land that had always been hers by inheritance, and that the truth be registered in the notary, ending once and for all the lie that had been buried, literally, in an empty coffin in the Serafunda cemetery. The grave was opened with the family's authorization, and what was found inside confirmed everything. Stones wrapped in one of Orela's old dresses, left there to give weight to the coffin. The priest prayed a new mass, not of farewell, but of thanksgiving. And Orela's name was erased from the headstone, replaced by a simple plaque that today marks only the date when the truth finally came to light. Vicente and Orela did not remarry immediately. They took time to rebuild trust, to relearn each other after so many years separated by a lie that neither of them had chosen. In the first months, Orela still slept in a separate room, fearing that everything was happening too fast. And Vicente respected every step she took, knowing that lost time is not recovered in haste. Bento, little by little, learned to call that woman mother. At first, it was just Donna, Nazari. Then it became Aunt Orela. And one day, without anyone marking the exact date, the boy simply called her mother during dinner, as if that word had always belonged to her. Orela had to leave the table to cry in the kitchen, and no one needed to ask why. Fazenda Boa, Esperanca, once again had, after nearly a decade, the sound of an entire family gathered at the table. Zeca, the old foreman, said he had never seen Vicente laugh like that. A laugh that seemed to have been stored away for years, waiting for the right moment to return. Donna Carina lived her last years under the same roof, cared for by her son and the daughter-in-law she once tried to erase, carrying the weight of a regret that, according to her own words, was the only fair inheritance she deserved to leave. She never spoke again of debt, land, or surname. She learned, too late, to be proud of it, but in time to experience it, that family is not protected by erasing those we love, but by having the courage to face the truth, no matter how difficult it may be. There are lies we tell to protect, and there are lies we tell just so we do not lose what no longer truly belongs to us. Orila's story reminds us that the truth, no matter how buried it is, always finds a way to rise to the surface, whether in a forgotten embroidery, in a belated confession, or in the gaze of a child who without fully understanding why, the face of someone who should always have been there. No one has the right to decide, out of fear or self-interest, who deserves to be remembered as alive or as dead. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage is not to win, but simply to return to claim one's own name. If this story touched your heart, leave below in the comments what you felt the most. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. Here, we will always have a new story waiting for you. Until next time, and thank you for walking with me until here.